The United States national debt is once again at the forefront of American politics, as President Joe Biden and the Republican-controlled House of Representatives clash over raising the limit on the national debt. As it has for years now, the debt crisis hangs over the American government like a dark, ominous storm cloud, while public concern about federal spending continues to rise as well. However, to many, every time debates and headlines surrounding the debt crisis rear their head, it can be more a source of confusion than anything else. What exactly is the national debt? Why is it considered a crisis? Why and how did it get so large? And what really are the potential consequences? Many Americans are truly in the dark when it comes to these issues, and it's not their fault. The national debt isn't often explained or discussed in a way that's accessible to the average person. Additionally, the discussion around its potential impacts can be quite complex and nuanced, making it difficult for individuals without a background in economics or finance to fully understand the implications on both the economy and their own personal finances. Therefore, it's important that we take a closer look at the US national debt crisis and dive into how it works, how we got here, where things are headed, and what it all means for the country's future. First and foremost, let's jump into the facts of the matter. Based on data made available by the Treasury Department, as of recently, the total debt of the US federal government sits at around $31.46 trillion. And just about all of this debt is considered subject to the statutory debt limit. More on that in a minute. A great way to understand the absolute enormity of this number is by comparing it to the United States yearly GDP. Debt to GDP can be a very useful metric because it allows us to see the debt in relative terms, in effect comparing the overall debt against the overall size of the economy. In the fourth quarter of 2022, the US's GDP was estimated at around $26.13 trillion, leading to a whopping 121.2% debt to GDP ratio, one of the highest in the world. Now, how in the world does the federal government manage to rack up such ludicrous amounts of debt? Well, it's fairly simple, really. Like an individual, debt is accumulated when a country spends more than it earns. In the government's case, this means budgetary spending that exceeds annual revenue, which mostly comes from taxes and a few other sources. When spending outpaces revenue, governments sell bonds to make up for the shortfall. These bonds, typically referred to as treasuries, represent the outstanding debt that the government must eventually repay. This now brings us to a main concern surrounding the national debt: repaying it. In 1917, Congress created the debt limit or debt ceiling, setting a high watermark of outstanding debt beyond which the US government cannot continue increasing. As of January of this year, that ceiling was legislated to be $31.4 trillion, and the outstanding debt was at that limit too once again. This crisis of breaching the debt ceiling has come to rear its head every few years now, marring US politics and causing quite a stir each time, before the ceiling is ultimately raised and the can kicked down the road. How did it get to this point, and what consequences can we expect in the future? To put the US national debt crisis into context, it's necessary to go back a little. The United States has been increasing debt from its very beginning. Debt from the Revolutionary War amounted to close to $75 million. In the intervening decades, federal debt would grow and contract year to year, notably shrinking in 1835 after the sales of some federally owned lands, whereas it would subsequently grow over 4,000% throughout the American Civil War. By 1922, US federal debt hovered around $400 billion, but the coming decades would host some of the largest and most jarring increases to the debt. The US debt to GDP ratio hit its last peak in the aftermath of World War II, but more recent events, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Great Recession in 2008, and most recently the COVID-19 pandemic, have all triggered massive, unprecedented increases in the federal debt. After the budget surplus of 2001 under President George W. Bush, the last most recent surplus, I might add, tax breaks and defense spending drove the addition of trillions to the debt. Then under the administration of Barack Obama, largely driven by the economic bailout of 2008 and large increases to the federal budget, national debt rose from around $9 trillion in 2007 to almost $20 trillion by 2016. Again, under President Donald Trump, the debt continued to grow. New tax cuts that were not balanced by spending cuts likely spurred the addition of another $1 trillion or so to the record-setting total. Finally, under the present-day Biden administration, the fiscal response to the COVID-19 pandemic has added trillions more. $3 trillion, in fact, in 2020 alone. Today, the debt sits at a stunning $31.4 trillion and counting, with no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Where does this situation lead? On January 19, 2023, the US federal government once again reached the debt ceiling, and with no immediate plans for legislating an increase to the limit, American lawmakers were sent scrambling. While Congress was caught unprepared, the Treasury Department quickly worked to enact what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen described as extraordinary measures. To avoid hitting the debt limit, the Treasury Department announced it would temporarily stop issuing debt and start selling existing investments. This included suspending the reinvestment of certain government securities funds, such as the Civil Service Retirement and Disability Fund. By reducing the amount of outstanding debt subject to the limit, the Treasury hopes to continue paying government bills in full and on time. As of now, Congress has an opportunity to get to work on either increasing the debt limit once more or pivoting, as Republicans are pressing them to, and bringing spending under control, limiting further deficit spending. However, it is hard to predict the actions of Congress. While it's certainly possible that Congress could work to reduce government spending to levels under that of government revenue, many experts believe this to be unlikely. In the meantime, federal debt is expected to continue growing, and quite rapidly if certain estimates are to be believed. Most strikingly, economists forecast that by 2033, interest payments on the debt itself will cost on the order of $1.4 trillion each year, a figure larger even than national defense spending or Medicaid benefits. However, not all economists and scholars agree on what might be the main debate surrounding the national debt crisis. Is it even a problem? When we begin to predict the consequences of the ballooning federal debt, there's very few existing cases to learn from. Few countries actually have debt ceilings, and those that do have yet to feel any adverse economic effects from them. Denmark, for example, has a debt limit of its own. However, it rarely spends enough for this to be an issue. Its total debt is only about 14% of the ceiling. Other countries, notably Greece, Italy, and Japan, are among the few large, advanced economies that have higher debt-to-GDP ratios than the United States, but none of which have yet faced severe economic disruption as a result. It is therefore difficult to predict what awaits the US and its economy. Economists, however, can make a few assumptions. As it relates to growth, burdensome levels of national debt can often undermine economic performance, especially when the net result is suboptimal transfers, essentially by boosting demand without causing an increase in production. This can take the form of inflation, business uncertainty, or generally distorted economic activity. On the topic of inflation, high levels of debt can lead to an increase, as the government has to borrow more to meet its obligations, resulting in a growth of the money supply. This in turn can cause a rise in prices, leading to inflationary pressures, which further weakens the economy. The US economy, of course, is already dealing with high inflation at the moment, with experts divided on whether or not this will continue. Furthermore, the well-being of society, through the funding of various social programs, is also potentially at risk due to growing federal debt. As the debt burden increases, the government may resort to cutting spending on social programs like healthcare, education, and welfare. Finally, some have argued that as the US government borrows more and more, it becomes increasingly reliant on foreign creditors, which could undermine the country's economic and political power. And as the government struggles to manage its debt, it may begin to lose its reputation as a global leader in economic and political affairs, particularly to rising nations like China, which is estimated to hold about $870 billion of US debt itself. Still, there are economists and policymakers who believe that rising federal debt is no danger at all. In fact, many movements have sprung up throughout the years, pushing to abolish the debt ceiling altogether. However, most economists and policymakers are at least in agreement that the current state of affairs is unsustainable, meaning it will likely come down to Congress to inevitably chart a way forward, and maybe, just maybe, the issue of the US national debt can be solved. In the end, the US federal debt crisis represents a long-standing issue that's often been exacerbated by major events such as wars, economic crises, and pandemics. The federal debt has once again reached an all-time high, with the debt-to-GDP ratio at a staggering 121.2%, one of the highest in the world. The debt ceiling, set by Congress in 1917, has become a contentious issue every few years, wreaking havoc in US politics. Meanwhile, the recent breach of the debt ceiling has once again brought the problem to the forefront of American politics. With no simple solutions or even a halt to the growing deficit on the horizon, the US national debt crisis remains a complex and important issue. Its impact on the economy and future generations has yet to be revealed, but most certainly, it's an issue that will continue to hang over both the American government and public for quite some time.